join table to join two separate tables together and allow many-to-many relationships in a database. This is a fairly advanced technique, and we're going to start by creating a brand new app or brand new database. So I'm going to click on Create here and choose Blank and click on Create. It's going to ask me to name it, and I'm going to call it Invoice for now. I'm going to save it onto my desktop. Once that's done, you can see that it opens up my table window here, and you can see that I'm currently in the invoice table. These are the fields. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete all of those. These are the standard ones that are created when we create a new table, so I'm just going to get rid of all of those. Just make this so it fits into the screen. I'm going to go to my tables now. This is called invoice, and that's absolutely fine. I can leave it as that, and I can get back to my fields by clicking here. So the first thing we're going to do is add some fields for the invoice table. So this is our invoice table, and it's going to have one called invoice underscore PK. PK for primary key. This is going to ensure that each individual invoice has its own record number, and that record number is unique, so we can identify every single invoice in our system by its number. So we'll need to change this to number and create, and then we'll need to go into options here, and we'll need to ensure that it's a serial number, which will be done on creation and will increase by 1 each time. So we'll have invoice number 1, invoice number 2, invoice number 3, and so on. Just to make sure that the user can't change those invoice numbers, we'll also tick prohibit modification. It's not essential, but it's a useful thing to do to stop any changes happening. Click on OK, and that's been done. Next, we're going to need some other details for the invoice. I'm going to keep these details fairly brief, just so that we can see about the relationship rather than all of the details. So we'll have invoice date. We'll change that to a date and create that. We'll have invoice customer. So we'll have the customer's name. If we were doing a full system, we might well have a separate table as well for all the customer details, rather than including the customer details on the invoice, because our customers might order several different things on several different invoices, so we want to keep that separate. Otherwise, we'd have to create invoices and keep inputting customer details in for each invoice. So that's created. So we've got the date and we've got the customer, and I think that's all that we really need at this point in this table. So we will go to our tables, and we're going to create a second table. Now, our second table is going to be called items. There we go, and we'll create that table. And once again, we'll see that when we click in it, it's created some standard fields, which we'll just delete for now. And we'll create our own fields. Item underscore PK, same as before, number, create, go to options, choose serial number and prohibit modification. So that's done. And then we will add any other details. Now for this one, we just really only need the name of the invoice item. So we'll have invoice name, item name rather, and we'll change that to text and click on create. So we now have two tables, an invoice table and an item table, and it's important to understand before we go any further why we need a join table. It's useful to think of each record in a table, let's consider our invoices, each record in the table, we have no records at the moment, as an individual piece of card onto which we're going to write some information, or an individual piece of paper onto which we're going to write some information. If we think of our item database as well, or our item table as also a selection of pieces of paper with the items written on, then we can create a number of different items. I'm going to go for things like Xbox, PlayStation, iPad, and so on. Now, we don't want to write out those cards loads and loads and loads of times. We just want to keep a record of Xboxes and PlayStations and so on, because that's what we have. So we don't want to have a box full of pieces of paper that say iPad, 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 iPad. We just want the iPad in our table once. The problem is that if we create an invoice and then we want to add an iPad to that invoice, we would take our invoice piece of paper, we'd go to the other box, take our iPad piece of paper out, we'd attach that to the invoice and say this iPad belongs to this invoice, done. Now we create a new invoice and we get our invoice piece of paper and we go to the box to get the iPad piece of paper, and there is no iPad piece of paper in there. It's already been attached to that invoice. So really what we want to do is we don't want a box full of iPad, 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 because we'd have to keep adding to it, but we want to be able to just link the iPad record to the invoice record and say this invoice has iPads on it, and then another invoice, this has iPads on it. So we want to link those two things together, but keep them as two separate boxes so that we don't have to take things out of one box and put them with something else in the other box. We just link them together. And so that's what our particular join table is going to do. So here's what we'll need to do. If we look at our relationships here by clicking on this, we have invoices and we have items. And we can't join them together, because if we try and do that, as I say, we'd just take the details of one box, put it in the other box, and we would be stuck. So we're going to need something called a join table. So we will create the join table here in our table section. We're going to call it invoice underscore item underscore join underscore table. So really clear what that actually means, and we'll create that. And we'll go into that and we'll delete everything that's there. Now the first thing to understand is that we absolutely have to have a unique number, because we're going to be creating records in here that say this record belongs to this invoice and this item also belongs to this invoice. So we're going to need individual records to create that connection. It's like a secret code that uses numbers to join things together. So we're going to put PK just for our PK here, and just to identify it from the other ones, I'm going to add in underscore ID so that this is in the join table here. We're going to make sure that we put that as a number and create, and then we're going to choose serial number and prohibit modification. Done. Now the next thing we need is the way of joining them together. So we're going to need invoice, and we're going to call this underscore FK, foreign key, and that's a number, and we'll create that. And now we're going to have, let's just delete that, item FK, also a number, and we'll also create that. So now we have a table which has its own unique number for each record, and then each one of those records will have two other bits of information on it. A piece of information that tells you which invoice it relates to, and a piece of information which tells you which item it relates to. And we will link them together. So we go to relationships. We take our items and we put our items over here. And now what we do is we join our FK invoice to our PK invoice. We double click on the equal sign there, and what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to create new invoices, and we need to be able to create records in the join table. So we're going to tick all of those there. Now we're going to join our item to here, and this time we don't need to do any of those joins, because we're going to be joining our item directly to this table, which will connect to there, and we're going to create our items separately. So we don't need that join table to actually have anything ticked here. So we'll click on OK, and it takes us to our layout, as you can see here. Now our layout is very simple. We're not going to worry about changing any of the details of that, but what we're going to do is just tidy a couple of things up and add a few things. So we've already got invoice number 1. I'm going to edit the layout. I'm going to change the invoice date to a drop down calendar, and we're going to include the icon so that we can see it, and that's done. So now we can pick a date, pick today, and we can write in the name of the customer, call him Joe Blogs. Now what we need to be able to do now is this is our invoice. This is a record of what Joe Bloggs wants to buy. In order for that to work, we're going to need some items that Joe Bloggs can buy and be added to our invoice, and then we're going to need to have a window to see what it is that he's bought, what we call a portal. But before we do that, we'll need to go from our invoice table to our items table. We'll create a new item, item number 1, and we'll call that Xbox. Create a new record, record number 2, and we'll call that PlayStation. New record here, and we'll call that new record iPad. So we've now got 3 different items in our database. Each one of our items has its own individual number. You can just flick through those. So item 1 is an Xbox, item 2 is a PlayStation, item 3 is an iPad. Now, what I said to you before is that we don't now want to create a new record item 4 and also have that as an iPad. And then item 5 and also have that as an iPad, because we would need to just create those to infinity, because each time we did that and used one of those, we'd take it out of here and we'd need a new record in there. So we just want to record that one of the things that we sell, one of the items that we sell is an iPad, and the iPad reference number is a 3. So let's go back to our invoice here, and what we need to do now is create that window that takes us through. So we're going to go up to Insert, we're going to click on Edit Layout rather, and then we're going to go to Insert at the top, and we're going to choose Portal. Now we're going to show the records from our join table, and we're going to turn off our Use Active Row State. We've got 4 rows there, and click on OK. And we're just going to move all of the items across for now. So move all, like so. And there's our join table. And I'm just going to move it to line up. And just make it a little bit longer, a little bit wider. I'm just going to change the size of these as well. Okay, now, also so that we can see them, just going to select those. And I'm going to go up to here. And I'm just going to put a border around them like so, so that we can see the items. So if we have a look now, we exit that, we can see that this is invoice number 1. It was created on the 6th of May and it belongs to the customer Joe Bloggs. What we need to do now is we need to choose an item. So from our items, we're going to need to actually choose something. Now, we don't want to just type things in, so we really want a drop-down list of the items that are in our database. So here's our items, item FK. So we select that, we go over here to the data one, and we choose drop-down list. Now there are no values here at all for us to choose from, so we need to click on here to create a new drop-down list, and in our drop-down list, which we'll call item, we're going to use values from a field that we've already created, and that field is going to come from our item table and is going to have our item number, but also numbers are not useful to us, so we'll also tick here that we want to see the item name, and more than that, we only want to see the item name. So we don't want to see the numbers, we're not really interested in the numbers at this point. So we'll click on OK, and click on OK, and click on OK. Now we've got this as a drop-down list, item is selected, and it's probably useful to have a tick there, an arrow there, so that the user knows that that is a list that they can select from. So at this point, we can choose that, and we can say, Mr. Bloggs would like an iPad. Now, what we have here is we have the invoice number. We have a look here. This is the invoice number. This is our invoice foreign key, and this is our item key. Now, as you can see, the item FK shows just the number once we're done, and we really want to see actually the name of the item. So we're going to just drop that very small like so, and we're going to create a new one here. We'll just copy that, so drag that across like so. I'm going to take it from our items, and we want the item name. We don't need a label, so we'll click on that. So let's just move that to there, and let's see if that's done. There we go. We have our item that we can select, and we have the name there. Now, it's not a very neat and tidy way of doing it. There is a better way now of overlaying things, but I've actually left it like this for now so that you can see what's actually happening. Because what I'm going to add here is I'm going to add some titles. So let's just add those titles here. So this is going to be our invoice number. Whoops. There we go, invoice number. So I'll put that there. Copy that and paste that across. This is going to be our invoice foreign key. And this comes from our join table, remember. Copy this. And we will make that our item number. And we don't need to worry about the item name. Now, the reason I've done that, if you look at this, this tells you that the code is as follows. Invoice number 1 connects to record number 1 in our join table and includes item number 3. Let's see how that works if I add another item to this. If I add a PlayStation to this, then here we have, wait a minute, my apologies, got those two the wrong way around. This is our invoice foreign key, or this is our invoice, this is our join table key, join table number, my apologies, and this is our invoice number. Okay, let's go back to that. So this is join table record number 1, belongs to invoice number 1 and includes item number 3. This is join table record number 2, which belongs to invoice number 1 and includes item number 2. So we have a code here which tells us which join table each of the invoices belongs to. So invoice number 1 belongs to join table number 1 record, and invoice number 1 also belongs to number 2 record. So that's really important because we've got 2 items in there. So if I add a third item now, so I add the Xbox, we can see that join table record number 3 is still linked. They're all linked to invoice number 1. And those are the items. Now, just to show how that is different, if you look at these, so we have 113 as our code, 212 as our code, 311 as our code. Those are unique, and we'll see how they're unique by creating a new record here. This is invoice number 2, same date, different customer. And now we're going to select an item for Jack Black, and he wants an Xbox. Now what we can see is that the join table record is join table number 4, or record number 4 rather. It belongs to invoice number 2 and it includes item number 1. If we go back, this also includes item number 1 but belongs to invoice number 1, and it's linked by join table record number 3. So join table record number 3 says 1 and 1, join table record number 2, 1 and 2, join table record 1, 1 and 3. So all of these join table records refer to invoice number 1 and tell us what's on that invoice number 1. Go across to here, this table belongs to invoice number 2 and tells us what's on invoice number 2, which is another Xbox from our list. If I add one more item, let's say a PlayStation, we can see we've got yet another join table record. It belongs to invoice number 2 and it includes the details about item number 2. Now let's have a look at our item invoice join table, and let's just look at it like this. Here we have our secret key, if you like. If we want to know about invoice number 1, we'll need to look at join table records 1, 2 and 3 because they're all related to number 1. And that will tell us what items are on there. There are 3 records all related to invoice number 1 because there were 3 items on there. If we want to look at invoice number 2, we need to look for any of the join table records that reference number 2, and record number 4 and 5 reference number 2 and tell us what items are on there. So in actual fact, if we look at our invoice table, we've got 2 invoices. If we look at our item table, we've got 3 items. But if we look at our invoice join table, we've now got 5 records, and those 5 records create individual codes that tell us which invoice they belong to and which item is on there. So if we want to look at the invoices, the invoice here says, okay, this is invoice number 1. Find me all the records that have invoice number 1. That's these records here. What do those records contain? They contain these items. So as I say, the layout of this would need to change. There is a way to overlay this on top of there so that we don't see the numbers, and we don't necessarily, we know that this is invoice number 1, so we really don't need that information. We can get rid of that straight away. And we don't really need a join table record either, because we know that that's what's actually happening. So we can get rid of both of those. So what we've actually got here is some way of selecting the item and the item name. And there we go, like so. This still belongs to, even though I've deleted those, this still belongs to invoice 1. This is invoice 2. The join table record and the invoice number are now hidden because the user doesn't need to see them, and the system will work. So we'll add one more item. There we go. We'll go for yesterday. We'll add another customer, that's Sue Smith, and she wants an Xbox, and there we go. There's our Xbox. Flip back, and there's Jack Black. There's all the details of his invoice, and there's Joe Bloggs. There's the details of his invoice. And of course, we can create this portal, make it much bigger if we want to. You double click on there. Number of rows initially is 4, but we could have 10 rows on there if we wanted to, and that would then give us much more space to add more items. Of course, once we get into that, we might also want to add the number of items, and we might also want to have the cost of the item and a calculation that works out the total, but that's later on. This just shows you, going back to manage database, the relationship that we need to have. Remember that on this side we tick everything, on this side we tick nothing. Create your join table like this, and the 2 tables that you want to join together like this, and it should all work.